You know, when a society is staring down a crisis, we're talking plagues, economic collapse, just deep, deep uncertainty. Faith often steps up and becomes this incredibly powerful force. But what kind of force? That's the real question. In this explainer, we're going to break down two totally different paths that pop up when belief has to deal with a world in chaos. One is all about control, and the other, well, it's about liberation.
All right, let's get right to the heart of it. When fear takes over, we all start looking for some kind of security, don't we? It's just human nature. But here's the big question this all hinges on. When that happens, does our faith become a fortress, with these super high walls and strict rules? Or does it become more like a bridge, something that pushes us to actually connect with people and, fight for a better world?
So, those two paths, they lead to two wildly different answers. On one side, you've got this thing called legalism, which, as you can probably guess, is all about control and rules. And on the other side, liberation theology, which is all about justice and solidarity. Let's dig into that first path, the path of control.
All right, path one, the fortress of rules. Just picture it, a world spinning into chaos. This first path is a direct response to that chaos, and the response is to build a fortress made of rules. It's really an attempt to force some order and predictability on everything when it feels like the whole world is falling apart.
So what exactly is religious legalism? Well, at its core, it's a system where following the rules, that becomes way more important than the actual faith itself. It's all about the outward stuff, the performance, what you're wearing, what you're eating, the specific way you pray. And these rules, they create this really clear, hard line between who's in the group and who's out.
But why? Where does this desperate need for super strict rules even come from? It's born from anxiety. It's born from fear. When a crisis hits, we just crave certainty. And so, what do? We cling to these really black and white rules, kind of believing that if we can just follow them perfectly, to the letter, then we'll be safe.
In this image, wow, it's such a powerful metaphor for what a system like this can feel like. You see a stop sign, but you're literally not allowed to go in any direction. It's the system that promises you security, but what it actually delivers is paralysis. Yeah, you might be safe, but you are absolutely trapped.
Okay, now here's where it gets really interesting. This is the core mechanism. See, most faith traditions, they kind of say, hey, you belong here, and because you belong, you will be transformed. But legalism, it completely flips that script. It says no, you have to be transformed first, you have to prove it, and only then can you belong. Performance comes before acceptance. It's a subtle change, but it is absolutely profound.
And the human cost of all this is just staggering. Can you imagine living under that kind of constant pressure? This heavy, heavy burden of expectation? You're always measuring yourself against the rules, and you're always falling short. It's a perfect recipe for anxiety and crippling perfectionism, which is pretty much the exact opposite of the peace that faith is supposed to bring, right?
But what if there's a totally different way? What if, instead of building fortresses, faith actually tears down walls? And that brings us to our second path, the call for liberation. This is a path that doesn't run away from the world's problems. It runs towards them, motivated by the suffering it sees.
So what is this path? It's called liberation theology. And basically, it's a framework for interpreting Scripture, but you're reading it from the perspective of the poor and the marginalized. And when you do that, when you change your vantage point, a whole new image of God starts to emerge. Not a God who's just a rule giver, but a God who is a liberator.
And look, this isn't some brand new idea. It's deeply rooted in Scripture. This quote you see here from the Gospel of Luke, this is basically Jesus' mission statement right at the start of his ministry. And what's at the very top of his to-do list? Good news to the poor and set at liberty those who are oppressed. This right here is the biblical bedrock of liberation theology.
And here, right here, is the game changer. Remember that whole procedural inversion we just talked about with legalism? Well, liberation theology flips it right back. It goes back to you belong, and because you belong, you will be transformed. It's just this radical shift away from performance-based acceptance and towards a community built on solidarity that actually empowers people to make real change.
The guiding principle here has a bit of a fancy name, the preferential option for the poor. But don't let the name fool you. It's a pretty simple idea. It just means that God's love has a special concern, a special focus on the poor and the marginalized. And the argument goes, if you're going to follow that God, then you have to share that concern. You have to have that same fire for justice.
Okay, so now we've got these two paths, right? Two totally different visions for what faith can be. But what happens when these ideas actually hit the messy reality of the real world? Let's put both of these systems under the microscope and see what the consequences really are.
First up, let's look at the consequences of legalism. And honestly, they're pretty stark. What tends to happen is that spiritual vitality just collapses into bondage. It breeds this environment of insecurity where people are either puffed up with pride because they think they're nailing it, or they're crushed by despair because they know they're not. Trust just erodes because your neighbors basically become your judges. And forget about dissent. It gets suppressed, creating these toxic echo chambers.
But liberation theology is not without its own set of critiques, for sure. The Vatican, for instance, raised some serious warnings. They were concerned about what they saw as an uncritical use of Marxist analysis and the idea of class struggle. There was a real fear that salvation was being reduced to a purely political project. And a big one was that the focus on right action, or orthopraxis, could end up undermining right belief, orthodoxy.
But here's a really important thing to understand about liberation theology. It is not a monolith. It's not a one-size-fits-all kind of thing. The core idea, interpreting faith from the perspective of the oppressed, that idea has been adapted all over the world to fight different kinds of injustice. In Latin America, the focus was on economic oppression. But then you have Black theology, which focuses on racial injustice and white supremacy, and feminist or womanist theologies that tackle gender inequality. It's a framework that is constantly evolving.
So there we have it. Two paths, one question. We've walked through two incredibly different responses to a world in crisis. Two paths, both starting from a place of faith, but man, do they lead to wildly different destinations.
And when you boil it all down, this is the core tension. Is faith ultimately about finding security by following the rules, or is it about finding justice through solidarity with others? It's a choice between control and liberation. That really is the fundamental question.
So one path, it prioritizes order and purity, and it does that by building boundaries, building walls. The other path prioritizes justice and solidarity, and it does that by crossing those same boundaries. One builds walls, the other builds bridges.
And so I'll just leave you with this final question to think about. Where do you see these patterns of control and liberation playing out in the world today? In your own community, maybe even in your own life? Where do you see faith being used to build walls, and where do you see it being used to break down barriers? The answer, I think, tells us a whole lot about the kind of world we're all building together. All right, today we're going to deconstruct something I like to call the legalism machine. We're going to pop the hood and see exactly how these really rigid, rule-based systems take hold in our communities, what keeps them running, and, most importantly, the very real human cost they carry.
And this image right here, wow, it just nails the central problem, doesn't it? At first glance, it promises so much clarity, a sign for every possible direction. But then you look closer. It's an impossible trap. You can't go left, you can't go right, you can't even go forward or back. It's this illusion of perfect order that leads to total paralysis. This is the perfect metaphor for what we're talking about today.
So let's get into it. What exactly is legalism? It's a word that gets thrown around a lot, but it's so much more than just having a bunch of rules. It's a complete system, you know? It's a mindset, it's a structure, it's the whole shebang.
Okay, so you can think about legalism on three different levels. Theologically, it's this idea that you can earn God's favor through your own actions, like you're racking up points. Psychologically, it's all about fear and perfectionism, where you're constantly grading yourself against some impossible standard. And then structurally, well, that's when you see those rules applied with zero compassion. Think of those zero-tolerance policies that completely ignore the human element of a situation.
But here's the thing. A machine like this doesn't just appear out of thin air. No way. It has to be built somewhere, and it thrives in a very specific kind of breeding ground, one that's full of stress, anxiety, and a deep sense of uncertainty.
So, when a whole community is under immense stress, think of Europe after the plague, for example, people get desperate for security. It creates this deep psychological need for black and white rules because it makes a scary, unpredictable world feel certain and safe. And that fear, it also triggers this powerful instinct to protect your own group, making strict conformity feel like the only way to survive and keep threats out.
So we've got the blueprint, we've got the factory floor. Now it's time to look at the engine itself. And what makes this machine run is that it completely flips the very idea of faith and belonging right on its head.
Okay, this right here is absolutely crucial. I call it the procedural inversion. See, in a healthy model, grace comes first. The idea is you are accepted, you belong, period. And it's out of that safety that you grow and transform. But legalism flips that script completely. It says, nope,
You have to conform first, you have to perform, meet the standard, check all the boxes, and only then will we accept you. All of a sudden, belonging isn't a gift anymore, it's a wage you have to constantly earn.
And this mental flip creates this little voice in your head, right? It's this constant internal monologue, and Counselor Lou Priolo just captures it perfectly. I've got to do this to earn more favor with God. Every single action becomes a transaction. It's not about relationship, it's about climbing a spiritual ladder.
And what happens next is this thing just starts feeding on itself. A really powerful self-policing cycle is born. People start judging themselves, judging each other. Am I praying enough? Am I as good as they are? It just fuels this toxic cycle of comparison and shame, where the community itself starts to enforce the rules out of a collective fear of not measuring up.
Now this internal mindset, this pressure cooker, it doesn't stay internal for long. Pretty soon, that engine starts to build some serious institutional walls around itself, making it incredibly difficult to question, to challenge, or to ever get out.
And this is how those abstract fears become very concrete policies. Gatekeeping isn't just a vague feeling anymore. It's actual doctrinal quizzes and lifestyle contracts you have to sign. Boundaries become strict dress codes and mandatory attendance. And your devotion? Oh, that becomes something you can quantify, track with tithing reports and logs of your volunteer hours. Faith basically gets turned into a performance review.
And look, this isn't just a religious thing, not by a long shot. You see echoes of this machine everywhere. You see it in authoritarian movements that demand absolute ideological purity and crush any dissent. You see it in the cold logic of bureaucracy, where rules are rules and the human context is totally ignored. You see it in purity cultures that create this harsh binary of clean versus unclean, shaming anyone who falls short. And you definitely see it in modern technocracy, where our worth is judged by data, tracked through metrics and surveillance.
So, we've seen how the machine gets built and how it runs, but what's the real damage? What's the human cost? In this last part, we're going to look at the aftermath and, more importantly, the path toward freedom.
This image just says it all, doesn't it? This isn't a system of freedom. It's a heavy, oppressive weight. It's the crushing burden of expectation, the constant fear of falling short, that ultimately just leaves people feeling totally alone and exhausted.
And the consequences are just corrosive. Any sense of spiritual joy gets replaced by a joyless checklist of duties. People are constantly bouncing between pride, thinking they're nailing it, and complete despair because they know deep down they can't. Trust just evaporates because every neighbor is a potential judge, and if anyone dares to ask a hard question, they're silenced, leaving a perfect echo chamber where the machine just keeps on running unchecked.
But here's the good news. This machine can be dismantled. The path to recovery is all about reversing its logic. It has to start by recentering on Greece, the idea that acceptance is a gift, not a wage to be earned. It requires leaders who are willing to be vulnerable, to admit they don't have all the answers. It means building real trust where people can be honest without fear of being shamed. And ultimately, it's about choosing to elevate love, compassion, and mercy over the cold, rigid letter of the law.
So I want to leave you with this question to chew on. Thinking about this model, this machine, where do you see it in your own life? Maybe at work, in your family, or even just in the crazy expectations you put on yourself. Where are we building these little systems based on performance when what we really truly need is a culture of grace?
So today, we're going to dig into the invisible rules that really run our world. We'll see how, believe it or not, strict religious codes and modern economic systems can be surprisingly similar. And then we'll uncover a radical theology that tried to flip the script, turning faith from a tool of control into a powerful force for liberation.
It's a weird question, right? I mean, one's about God and sacred laws, the other's all about markets and money. But what if I told you they both lean on these powerful, unwritten rules that decide who's on top, who's in, and who gets left out? Let's get into it.
Okay, so first up, we've got to understand how these systems of power actually work. They all build these invisible structures that kind of guide how we act, and more importantly, justify why the world is the way it is.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the pattern. Just look across the columns. It doesn't matter if the authority comes from a holy book, the laws of the market, or an empire. Each system creates a really clear in-group, the righteous, the successful, the colonizers, and by default, an out-group. And here's the kicker. Each one has a built-in story explaining why that pyramid of power isn't just a thing, but why it's actually fair and just.
And that's the key, right? This isn't just about brute force. It's about the story they tell.
These systems are so powerful because they get people to believe that the winners earned it, and the losers, well, maybe it's their own fault, or maybe it's just the natural or even divine order of things.
And this slide just lays it out perfectly. Take the old religious idea of the elect, the people chosen by God, where being successful in life might even be a sign of that favor. Well, look at the parallel in our modern idea of the successful. In both stories, being wealthy isn't just about money, it's seen as a sign that you're a good, worthy person. And the flip side, poverty isn't just a lack of cash, it can be framed as a moral failure.
Okay, but this is where the whole story takes a massive turn. Because inside these very same religious traditions, a totally different, radical idea started to bubble up. An idea that said, maybe, just maybe, God isn't on the side of the powerful rule makers, but on the side of the oppressed chain breakers.
And that leads us right into something called liberation theology. This was a movement that basically decided to reread the Bible, but not from the top down, not from the perspective of kings and priests, but from the bottom up, from the perspective of the poor and the marginalized.
For liberation theologians, this verse wasn't just some nice-sounding phrase. To them, this was Jesus laying out his mission statement. They looked at the whole arc of the Bible, from the Exodus, where slaves are freed from Egypt, all the way to Jesus' life, and they saw one consistent story. God is on the side of the oppressed. Period.
So this led them to their core principle, the preferential option for the poor. Now, this doesn't mean God doesn't love rich people. What it means is that because the poor and marginalized are the most vulnerable, you have a moral duty to see the world from where they stand, and to make their fight for justice your #1 priority. It completely flips the usual priorities on their head.
And here's another huge shift in thinking. They said sin isn't just about the bad things individuals do, like lying or stealing, it's also structural. The systems themselves, the economic and political structures that keep people poor or grind them down with racism, those systems are sinful because they go against God's vision for human dignity. And finally, they had this idea called praxis. Basically, faith has to be lived, not just thought about in your head. You don't start with figuring out the perfect beliefs and then maybe do something. No, you start by getting your hands dirty, by standing with the oppressed, and it's from that real-world action and experience that you reflect on what you believe. For them, doing the right thing was the path to believing the right thing.
Now, as you can probably guess, when you start putting these kinds of ideas into action, you're going to stir up some trouble. This wasn't just a conversation for academics, it was a real-world challenge to the people in power.
Yeah, this whole thing wasn't born in a quiet library. It was born on the ground, in the slums and villages of Latin America. Priests and nuns were there seeing crushing poverty right next to brutal military dictatorships, which were often propped up by the wealthy. And they had to ask themselves a hard question. What does our faith have to say about this?
And here's where we get to the heart of the controversy. To figure out why so many people were poor, these theologians started using tools from social science, including some concepts from Marxist analysis, to talk about things like class and exploitation. But for the Vatican, especially in the middle of the Cold War, that was a massive red flag. They were deeply worried that you couldn't just borrow those analytical tools without also importing the atheism and the call for violent class warfare that came with them.
So in 1984, the Vatican put out a document that laid it all out. They were concerned that these theologians were borrowing too much from Marxism. They worried that the Christian idea of salvation was being shrunk down to just a political project. They were afraid that all this talk of class struggle could be used to justify violence, and they felt that this focus on action was sidelining the importance of correct traditional doctrine. It was a serious theological clash with huge stakes.
But an idea this powerful couldn't be kept in just one part of the world. The core concept, reading the Bible from the perspective of the oppressed, started getting picked up and adapted to fight all kinds of different injustices all over the globe.
So in the United States and in apartheid South Africa, you had black theologians who argued that in a society built on racism, God is black, meaning God identifies completely with the black community in their struggle. They reread the Exodus as a story about liberation from slavery, and they saw the cross of Jesus in the horror of the lynching tree. It was a profound reimagining of faith in the fight against white supremacy. Then you had feminist theologians who applied that same critical lens to patriarchy, calling it a structural sin. They went back and challenged all the biblical interpretations that had been used for centuries to keep women down. And womanist theologians took it even further, focusing specifically on the unique,
overlapping oppression of race, gender, and class that black women face. And all the way in India, Dalit theologians picked up this framework to speak to the experience of those at the very bottom of the caste system, the so-called untouchables. They looked at Jesus, a man who broke all the social and religious purity rules to hang out with outcasts, and they saw him as a Dalit figure, someone who completely identified with the most rejected people in society.
So, after decades of controversy, adaptation, and struggle, where does all this stand today? What's the lasting impact of this powerful movement?
This timeline really tells an amazing story. You start in 1968 with this radical idea getting an official endorsement from bishops in Latin America. Then, by the 80s, it's under intense scrutiny from the Vatican itself. And then fast forward to 2013, and the very first pope from Latin America is elected, Pope Francis, and he starts talking in ways that sound awfully familiar.
I mean, just listen to this quote from Pope Francis. When he talks about an economy that kills because it creates exclusion and a throwaway culture, that language, that critique, could have been pulled straight from one of the founding documents of liberation theology. It really shows how the movement's central concerns have moved from the margins right to the center of Catholic social teaching.
And that brings us to the final question, which is really a question for you. We've seen how all these systems, religious and secular, create these powerful, invisible rules. But we've also seen how faith itself can be a tool to challenge those very rules. So the question for all of us is, what are the invisible rules shaping our world today? And what does real justice ask of us?
Okay, so what if I told you there's this hidden blueprint, one that connects ancient religious laws to, well, the systems that run our entire modern world? It's a pretty wild idea, and that's exactly what we're going to dive into today.
All right, let's just jump right in with a huge question. I mean, what if our modern world, things like capitalism, socialism, even colonialism, what if they were all secretly running on ancient religious rules? Like, the whole playbook wasn't written by economists or politicians, but by priests from way, way back. It sounds kind of out there, I know, but stick with me, because the parallels are, well, they're pretty mind-blowing.
So the heart of this whole thing is what you could call an ancient social blueprint. It's a framework for, organizing people, controlling how they act, and deciding who's in charge. And this blueprint has a name: religious legalism. The crazy thing is, once you learn to spot its pattern, you start seeing it absolutely everywhere.
So what is religious legalism exactly? Well, it's not really about personal faith. It's more like a social technology. It's a system built around one key thing: strict, visible obedience to a set of sacred rules. Stuff like what you can eat, how you have to dress, certain rituals you have to perform. If you follow the rules, boom, you're one of the good guys. You're in the in-group. But if you break them, you're a sinner, an outsider. And just like that, you've created social order, a clear hierarchy, and a super powerful way to keep a community in line.
And that brings us to our first huge parallel. Because maybe the most basic thing all these systems do, whether they're religious or not, is draw a line in the sand. They create a really clear us versus them.
Just look at how this pattern plays out. In religious legalism, it's the righteous versus the sinners. Simple. In capitalism, it's the winners, the productive people, versus the so-called undeserving poor. In socialism, you've got your loyal comrades on one side and the class enemies on the other. And with colonialism, it was the civilized versus the savage. See? The names, the justifications, they all change. But that core logic, that division of us and them, it's exactly the same.
Okay, so if all of these systems are about dividing people, how do they get away with it? How do they justify that kind of power? Well, they do it by creating their own set of sacred, must-not-be-questioned rules. And this right here is where it starts to get really interesting.
I love this quote from the philosopher Walter Benjamin. He said, "Capitalism can be seen as a purely cultic religion, with no mercy." And that just nails it, right? He wasn't seeing capitalism as just some economic system. He saw it as a kind of religion, a cult even, that demands constant worship, through work and buying stuff. It puts everyone in a state of guilt or debt, and the market itself, it acts like this merciless god, handing down judgment.
And you see this across the board. Secular systems basically cook up their own versions of religious dogma. So instead of divine will, you get the invisible hand of the market. Instead of Holy Scripture, you have the Constitution or a party manifesto. A king's divine mandate to rule becomes a colonial civilizing mission. The point is, these new ideas are treated with the exact same reverence. They become these sacred, unquestionable truths that hold the whole power structure up.
And believe me, this isn't just some abstract theory. There are some chilling, real-world examples. Take the Spanish requerimiento. This was an actual legal document, basically a religious permission slip for conquest. The conquistadors would show up and read this thing to indigenous people, often in Spanish or Latin, which they couldn't even understand. It demanded they submit to the church and the King of Spain, and if they didn't, well then any violence, any war against them was officially declared a just war. I mean, it's a perfect example of religious law being used as a weapon for empire.
So these sacred rules, they don't just justify who's in charge. They also create a moral pecking order. And you can see this so clearly when you look at how these systems treat wealth and poverty.
The sociologist Max Weber absolutely nailed this connection with his idea of the Protestant ethic. The logic is actually pretty simple, but it is so powerful. Okay, so step 1. The belief is that disciplined, hard work is your religious calling. It's what you're supposed to do. Step 2. If you work hard and become successful, that success is seen as a sign that God is on your side, that you're one of the chosen ones. And that leads to the really powerful punchline in step 3. Suddenly, being wealthy isn't just about money. It's a sign that you're a good person. And being poor, that might just be a sign of a moral or spiritual failure.
And this way of thinking didn't just stay in the church. It mapped perfectly onto the secular world. You have the religious idea of the unworthy sinner. You know, someone whose poverty is their own fault because they're lazy. Well, that finds its twin in the secular idea from Victorian times of the undeserving poor. They made a distinction between the deserving poor, say a widow, and the undeserving, meaning anyone who was able-bodied but poor, who were basically blamed for their situation and seen as a moral problem. It is literally the same judgment call, just in a different outfit.
Okay, so let's start to pull all these threads together. When you do, you start to see this shared structure pop out, a common architecture of control that's hiding inside all of these different systems.
So what is this shared blueprint at the end of the day? Well, first, it's a system that creates very clear in and out groups to show who belongs and who doesn't. Second, it leans on some kind of sacred story, religious or not, to make its power seem legitimate. Third, it builds a moral hierarchy, ranking people based on how well they follow the rules. And finally, it has ways to reward the people who obey and punish the ones who step out of line. It's the same basic operating system, just with a different user interface slapped on top depending on the ideology.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty big question for ourselves, right? If this pattern is real, then what are the unquestionable, sacred rules that we live by today? What are the modern dogmas we just accept without a second thought? And maybe, more importantly, who do those rules define as the good guys, and who do they leave on the outside? Definitely something to chew on. Thanks for digging into this with me.
Hey, welcome to The Explainer. You know, we like to think of our modern world as totally secular, right? Built on logic, reason, and law. But what if I told you that the systems that run pretty much everything, our economies, our governments, are secretly following a much, much older set of rules, a religious blueprint? Let's dig in. Seriously, just think about it for a second. What if the very operating system for our political and economic lives is just a repurposed version of an ancient religious code? A blueprint designed at its core for social control, one that decides who's in, who's out, who wins, and who loses. So this original blueprint is something we can call religious legalism. Now think of it less like a book of beliefs and more like a society's software. The whole system runs on strict, absolute obedience to divine laws and rituals. It's not really about your inner faith, it's all about outward performance. Follow the rules and you're righteous. Break them and you're a sinner. It's a system that creates order by drawing some very, very clear lines in the sand. Okay, so how does this blueprint actually work in the real world? Well, its first and maybe most crucial job is to build what you could call the architecture of belonging. It is all about creating a crystal clear us and a them. And you can see how the pattern translates almost perfectly to our world. In religious legalism, you've got the righteous, the ones who follow the code, versus the sinners, who don't. Well, capitalism basically secularizes this exact idea. You have the winners, the successful, the wealthy, versus the so-called undeserving poor, whose poverty gets framed as a kind of personal, moral failing. And trust me, this pattern pops up everywhere. Colonialism drew its line between the so-called civilized colonizer and the savage native. Even many socialist states, while aiming for total inclusion, ended up creating their own binary. You had the loyal comrades on one side and the internal class enemies on the other, people who supposedly threatened the purity of the revolution. It's the same blueprint, just with different labels. All right, so once you've defined us and them, how do you justify the power structure that keeps things that way? The next part of the blueprint is all about making the rules feel absolute, unquestionable, legitimate. And how do you do that? You make them sacred. You know, the philosopher Walter Benjamin absolutely nailed this idea way back in 1921. He argued that capitalism functions just like a religion. It demands constant performance from us, productivity, consumption, and it traps people in this endless state of guilt, or more literally, debt. There's no forgiveness, no Day of Atonement. There's only more worship at the altar of the market. This slide here basically gives us the translation key. Divine will becomes the unquestionable, almost mystical logic of the invisible hand of the market. Holy Scripture gets replaced by a nation's sacrosanct constitution, and the divine right of kings, well, that gets a modern makeover as manifest destiny, a story that frames imperial expansion as a moral, almost sacred duty. And for a really jaw-dropping historical example, look no further than the Spanish Requerimiento. Conquistadors would literally read this document, often in Spanish or Latin, to people who had no idea what they were saying, declaring that God gave the Pope authority over the world, and the Pope gave these lands to Spain. So submit, and you'll be safe. Resist? Well, then you'll be justly conquered and enslaved. It was a religious warrant for conquest, all wrapped up in the language of law. Now, this blueprint doesn't just justify who's in charge, it also moralizes the outcomes, especially the economic ones. It creates what you could call a gospel of success, where the size of your bank account is supposed to reflect your moral worth. This whole logic was famously broken down by Max Weber as the Protestant ethic. It starts with this idea that hard, disciplined work is a divine calling. From there, it's a short hop to seeing worldly success, making a profit, as a sign of God's favor. That then morphs into the idea that wealth itself is proof of your virtue, which leads to the devastating flip side: poverty must be a sign of sin, or at least laziness. And this religious distinction, it jumped right off the page and became secular state policy. Just look at Victorian England's poor laws. They were absolutely obsessed with separating the deserving poor, widows, the disabled, people worthy of charity, from the undeserving poor, who were seen as morally corrupt. Those people were often punished in brutal workhouses to coerce them into becoming more moral. But here's the really fascinating part. This blueprint isn't just a tool for creating harsh inequality. The same logic of sacred, binding rules can actually be used for the exact opposite purpose: to enforce fairness and justice. For example, take the Jubilee laws from the Hebrew Bible. This was an incredibly sophisticated legal mechanism that was hardwired directly into the economy. It was based on the sacred idea that the land ultimately belongs to God, not to people. So it mandated that every 50 years, the whole system hits a giant reset button. Land was returned, debts were forgiven, all specifically to prevent a permanent underclass from ever forming. That's social justice, enforced by sacred law. So, as we pull all these different threads together, the shared architecture of control becomes, well, crystal clear. Whether you call it sacred or secular, these systems are really built on the same foundational pillars. Look, they all create in-groups and out-groups. They all justify their power with stories that are treated as sacred, whether that's God's will or the logic of the market. They all create these moral ladders, deciding who is deserving and who isn't. And they all enforce compliance through a set of rules and punishments, which at the end of the day define who gets to enjoy the benefits of being in the community and who gets left out. And that really leaves us with one final big question. If this ancient blueprint is still humming along in the background today, what are our unquestionable rules? What are the secular sacred truths that we're all told not to question? And at the end of the day, who do those rules truly serve? Thanks for watching. All right, let's jump right in. We're about to explore two worlds that you'd think have absolutely nothing to do with each other: the cold, hard logic of the free market and the ancient, sacred codes of religious law. But as you're about to see, they might just share a surprisingly similar instruction manual for how life is supposed to work. It's a bit of a weird question, isn't it? One's all about economics, profit, and loss. The other is about faith, morality, and salvation. But what if I told you that deep down, they both operate on a very similar set of unwritten rules? Rules about performance, about who is considered worthy, and about who gets to belong. Well, that's exactly what we're going to unpack. So let's get our terms straight. On one side, we've got neoliberalism, This is the idea that pretty much all of life should be run like a competitive market. And on the other side, we have religious legalism, which is this belief that morality is basically a strict checklist you follow to get right with God. Let's get a slightly clearer picture of each. You see, neoliberalism isn't just an economic policy, it's a whole worldview. The scholar Wendy Brown calls it the economization of all life, where everything from dating to education is treated like a marketplace. Some people even call it market fundamentalism, and that word, fundamentalism, already gives you a little hint about where we're headed with this comparison. Now, religious legalism. This is the idea that you can achieve spiritual righteousness just through your own effort by following every single rule perfectly. And this isn't just a feature of one religion. In fact, you can find critiques of this kind of thinking right in the Christian New Testament, where figures like Jesus and Paul warned against getting so obsessed with the letter of the law that you forget about things like justice, mercy, and faith. And that brings us to our first huge parallel between these two systems. See, both of them are built on what you could call a logic of performance. The basic idea is that your value, your worth, isn't just a given. It's something you have to prove, something you have to earn. This quote just nails the mindset, doesn't it? It frames the relationship between a person and God as a kind of transaction. It's almost like a business deal. Piety isn't really about a relationship of faith. It becomes a performance you put on to get a reward. And would you look at that? It's the exact mirror image in neoliberalism. In this worldview, you're basically an entrepreneur of yourself. Your whole job is to constantly perform, to compete, and to prove your value to the market. And the rewards for a good performance, success, money, and status. So here's the bottom line. In both of these frameworks, acceptance is totally conditional. It doesn't matter if we're talking about salvation or financial success. It's not a gift. It's not something you just get. It's something you have to earn through what you do, which leaves very, very little room for things like mercy or unearned grace. Okay, so if everything is based on performance, how do these systems actually make sure everyone toes the line? How do they enforce compliance? Well, that brings us to their very specific tools of control. Neoliberalism, well, it loves numbers. Think about it. Key performance indicators, or KPIs, at your job. Rankings for universities, your personal credit score. These are all metrics, and they're designed to measure us, compare us, and ultimately to discipline us. You have to perform well according to the numbers, or you risk falling behind. Now, religious legalism uses a different set of tools, but for the exact same purpose. Here, it's all about detailed codes of conduct, what you can eat, what you can wear, which rituals you have to perform. And you have religious leaders who act as monitors, ready to step in if anyone gets out of line. And the ultimate threat? Getting excluded from the community, or shunned. So what all of this creates is a really powerful gatekeeping effect. In both systems, there are all these procedural hoops you have to jump through, and the process itself becomes a kind of test that filters people, determining who gets the rewards and who gets left out in the cold. And this gatekeeping has massive real-world consequences. I mean, just look at this statistic. In a lot of welfare systems that are designed with this kind of neoliberal logic, the procedural hurdles, the paperwork, the appointments, the constant proving of eligibility are so overwhelming that 1 out of every 5 people who is legally entitled to benefits never actually gets them. The process itself becomes the barrier. It's a perfect example of how the system filters out anyone who can't perform all those administrative tasks. So, what's the actual human cost of living inside a system where you're constantly being measured and judged? How does it end up shaping who we are and how we relate to the people around us? Well, under neoliberalism, you learn to see yourself as a competitor. You're a personal brand that needs to be managed, and your identity gets all tangled up in your market success. In a legalistic religion, you learn to see yourself as an obedient follower, and your self-worth is measured by just how well you keep all the rules. And this has real psychological effects. Research, like this study from the British Journal of Social Psychology, has shown that when you're in a culture of constant competition, it actually fosters loneliness and social disconnection. I mean, it makes sense, right? When everyone is your rival, it's a lot harder to build genuine, trusting relationships. Legalistic groups can create this powerful feeling of community, for sure, but it's a conditional one. You belong as long as you conform. This creates a very tight in-group. Yeah, but it also creates this constant nagging fear of messing up and being cast out. It can make genuine trust feel pretty fragile when everyone is sort of watching everyone else. And just look at the language these systems use. Neoliberal talk often divides society into makers and takers, and legalistic religion, well, it splits the world into the saved and the lost. In both cases, the underlying message is crystal clear. There are winners and losers, insiders and outsiders. Belonging isn't guaranteed, it's something you can lose. Okay, let's pull all these threads together now. Let's step back and look at the big picture. What is the one fundamental principle that really unites these two very different worlds? This chart really lays it all out. Both systems directly link outcomes to your performance. Both have their ultimate authorities, whether it's sacred law or so-called market principles. They both judge people by very specific criteria: moral correctness on one side, economic efficiency on the other. And, crucially, both end up excluding people, shunning the unworthy or marginalizing the unproductive. And the critiques of these kinds of systems can be incredibly sharp. Pope Francis, for example, has talked about the dictatorship of an impersonal economy, arguing that when market logic is the only thing that matters, the most vulnerable people in society are just treated as disposable. It's a really powerful condemnation. Now, of course, to be fair, there are defenses for both of these viewpoints. Proponents of neoliberalism will argue that it's the most pragmatic engine for growth and individual freedom, and defenders of strict religious rules will say that they're a necessary safeguard, protecting the community from moral chaos and preserving essential values. But when you boil it all down, the ultimate parallel we see is this convergence on one core idea: compliance over compassion. When you take them to their extremes, both of these systems run the risk of prioritizing abstract rules, metrics, and procedures over the messy, complicated, and very real needs of actual human beings. Which leaves us with a final big question to think about. Whether we're talking about our economic policies or our moral communities, in systems built entirely on performance and earning your keep, where do we find room for grace, for unearned, unconditional acceptance?
All right, today we're tackling an idea that absolutely lit a fire under the 20th century church, one that sparked incredible hope and, let me tell you, some fierce controversy. It's called liberation theology, and at its very core is this wild idea that your faith isn't just about getting your soul to heaven later, but about freeing real people from real oppression right here and now.
So it all boils down to this one huge question. Can faith, something we usually connect with peace, with turning the other cheek, actually become a weapon for revolution, for radical change? It's a question that started bubbling up decades ago, and the answer that came out of it really did shake the foundations of the world. So to really get where this explosive idea even came from, we've got to go back to the beginning. We need to look at the problem it was desperately trying to solve because its roots are buried deep in a time of real crisis.
Okay, so picture it. It's the 1960s in Latin America. You've got millions upon millions of people trapped in just grinding poverty. And this wasn't just bad luck. It was the result of economic and political systems, often propped up by brutal military dictatorships that were specifically designed to keep the poor poor. For the Catholic Church, which had for a long time been an ally of the powerful, this was a massive moral crossroads. They had to pick a side.
And, well, things started to shift. And it happened in a few key steps. First, you have the Second Vatican Council, which basically threw open the church windows and let some fresh air in. Then, in 1968, something really stunning happens. At a conference in Medellin, the bishops of Latin America declare that the church must have a preferential option for the poor. This wasn't just a nice sentiment. It was a total realignment of priorities. And finally, in 1971, a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez publishes a book, and he gives this growing fire a name. Liberation theology was officially born.
Okay, so we've got the problem. What was the solution this new theology was putting on the table? Well, it wasn't just some political plan. It was a complete revolutionary rereading of the entire gospel. Let's dig into what they actually believed.
At the heart of everything is this idea of the preferential option for the poor. And this is a big one. This is not about charity, writing a check or feeling sorry for people. It's a theological bombshell. It claims that God is not neutral, that if you look at the Bible, from the story of Exodus right up to Jesus' own life, you see a God who is actively on the side of the poor and the marginalized. So if you want to follow that God, the church has to be the same thing. It's not an optional extra. It's the main mission.
And what Gutierrez is getting at here, it's not just a social observation. It's a deep, deep theological point. He's saying that you literally find Jesus Christ in the faces of the poor and the suffering. So choosing to stand with them isn't just a political act. It's choosing to stand with Jesus himself.
And this led them to expand the whole idea of what sin even is. It's not just about you or me doing a bad thing. They introduced this concept of structural sin. Think of it like the rules of a rigged game, an economic system that is designed to create massive poverty, or a political system built on racism. That system itself is sinful because it violates the dignity God gives to every person. The problem isn't just a few bad apples. The whole barrel is rotten.
Okay, and this next part completely flips the script on how you're supposed to do theology. The idea of praxis means you don't start in a dusty library with ancient books. No, you start by getting your hands dirty. You start with action, working for justice. You join the struggle, and then you reflect on that experience with the gospel in hand. It's basically a modern take on that old biblical line, faith without works is dead. Action has to come first.
I mean, you can probably guess what happened next, right? Ideas this radical, this explosive, they were never going to fly under the radar. It was pretty much inevitable that this would lead to a major, high-stakes showdown with the Vatican itself.
So the heart of the fight, it really boiled down to a couple of major disagreements. On one hand, the liberation theologians were using tools from Marxist analysis to figure out why people were poor. They saw it as just a useful, neutral social science tool. But the Vatican looked at that and saw a dangerous pact with an atheistic ideology that was all about class warfare. Then you had the liberationists arguing, hey, the church has to be political to speak truth to power. But Rome was deeply worried that this was shrinking the gospel down to just another political project and totally forgetting about its spiritual, eternal mission.
And this fear was laid out pretty bluntly by Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, who would later become Pope Benedict XVI. He was worried that this idea of the people of God was being twisted into a Marxist class struggle, basically pitting a new church of the people against the official hierarchical church. For him, this was a massive threat to the unity and the core beliefs of the faith.
But the counter-argument from Gutierrez was just as powerful. He said, look, this isn't about importing some foreign ideology. This is about being authentic Christians. Real theology, he argued, has to always keep its balance. It needs one foot planted firmly in the world of the Bible, and the other foot planted just as firmly in the real, painful world of the poor. If you lose either one, you've lost the plot.
But here's the thing about a powerful idea. It doesn't stay in one place. This debate wasn't just some internal Catholic squabble. The core message, that God sides with the oppressed, was way too potent to be contained. It just leaped across continents and started adapting itself to brand new struggles.
And what's so incredible is how this basic framework could be adapted everywhere. In the United States, in South Africa, it became black theology, fighting against white supremacy. Feminist theologians picked it up to challenge patriarchy in the church and society. In India, you had Dalit theology taking on the ancient caste system. And in South Korea, Minjung theology stood up to military dictatorship. You see, each one was facing a different kind of oppression, but the idea of a liberating God was the same.
So, after all that fire and controversy, where did this all end up? Well, it's a fascinating story. What started as a radical idea on the absolute margins was slowly, over decades, refined, and its core principles eventually got absorbed right into the mainstream.
You can really track this journey from rebellion to acceptance over 3 decades. The 80s, that was the decade of critique, with the Vatican putting out warnings. But by the 90s, Pope John Paul II was already using the language talking about structures of sin. And then, the real game changer, the 2010s, and the election of Pope Francis, the very first pope from Latin America. He didn't just accept these ideas, he made them a centerpiece of his entire papacy.
I mean, just think about it. When you hear Pope Francis talking about a throwaway culture or an economy that kills, you are hearing the core DNA of liberation theology being spoken from the throne of St. Peter. He's managed to take the central message, strip away the controversial ideological baggage, and present it as just a fundamental pastoral demand of the gospel.
And the influence today, it's huge, and it goes way beyond just the Pope. This way of thinking has inspired countless social justice groups and NGOs. It actually created the blueprint for ecological theology, connecting the cry of the poor with the cry of the earth. And today it's a standard subject taught in seminaries all over the world. What was once seen as revolutionary is now literally in the curriculum.
So all of this leaves us with one last big question for you to think about. The particular fights of the 1960s might be in the history books, but injustice, well, that's not going anywhere. We're facing down enormous new challenges. Climate change, the massive gap between the digital haves and have-nots, all sorts of new exploitation. So the question is,
what does it mean for faith to demand liberation in our world today? Thanks for joining me.